With the popularity of SJW compilations having waned, I expected the anti-feminist brigade to have punched itself out at this point. However, it seems that their MRA proclivities have fully taken over. Now, not only do they overlook our plight for women's rights, they want a new right for themselves. The right to become a woman. Controlling how we express our womanhood just wasn't enough for them, so they're taking it for themselves altogether. Beta lanklets like ContraPoints and skinny fat losers like PhilosophyTube attempt to disguise their pathetic masculinity that is inextricably linked with their autistic obsession with pretentious academic solipsism by pretending to be women. Sorry boys, but it takes more than doing a reverse Elizabeth Holmes and sprawling porcelain trinkets all over your house to be one of us. The Motel 6 kitsch lighting and costumes might impress your viewers into tolerating your LARP, but no self-respecting woman would ever seriously consider you one of them. This is why they try so desperately to sway TERFs, even though they're such a minuscule demographic. I know it must upset you that a goblin like myself who got exposed to super-physiological amounts of androgens in the womb is still more of a woman than you could ever be. I get to play modded Morrowind and spurg out about extraneous topics all day, and I'll never have to defend my femininity. Better yet, even if someone questions it, it gives me precisely 0 dysphoria. Funny how that works. Gender deconstruction is their ridiculous cope, wherein they pretend that gender identity varies completely independently from biological sex, and it's just a coincidence that 99% of people identify with the gender they were assigned at birth, or they were socially conditioned to by the media and the patriarchy. Although, you could never condition someone to be gay and trans, only cis and straight. Even they performatively disprove their own deconstructionist rhetoric, because they always get hormones and try to simulate the appearance of cis women. Because if we're playing by postmodernist rules, why try to escape your male body and obtain a female one if neither of those categories actually exist? I mean, according to you, because of the 0.0001% of people out there born with truly ambiguous sex characteristics, there are no physical traits that can be definitively described as male or female, so a set of hairy nuts is just as female as a vagina for all you care. Anyone can be female, as long as they say they are, even if they look like Tyson Fury, so why bother with the surgeries and the sissy juice and doing blackface of women? If the answer is that it gives you gender dysphoria not to do so, well, how could looking like a male make you feel bad if there's no such thing as looking like a male? Besides, thinking you need dysphoria to be valid is transmedicalism. So, if it's not about internal discomfort, it must be so that other people recognize you as a woman. In which case, aren't you just reinforcing the oppressive beauty standards females are held to? Shouldn't we be working towards the abolition of those stereotypes altogether? Once you get to this point, they imply you're arguing in bad faith, which is the definition of an ad hominem, but whatever. It's no longer about whether you're right, but the fact that you're a bigot for rigorously holding them to their own standards. Obviously, it's a systemic problem that could only be solved with a systemic solution, rather than actions on the behalf of individuals, so please just let me wear skirts and get euphoric in the meantime. Sheesh, even vegans are more ideologically consistent than you. Despite the fact that the meat industry still exists and most people perpetuate carnivore culture, they at least stop buying animal products themselves, but you couldn't go one day without your precious makeup. They try all sorts of mental gymnastics to leap over the biological hurdle, such as pretending that language isn't about material facts but social conventions. You know what? You're right. No one's thinking about your chromosomes as you walk down the street, so you technically fit the descriptive definition of how the word woman is used. If you pass. Unfortunately, there's a lot of old demented autogynephiles out there who will never learn how to do makeup, and will always look like the senile perverts they are. Even if they do start watching James Charles and contouring, it's like putting lipstick on a pair of balls. But even in that case, where people definitely would be thinking about that geriatric trap's XY status, you still think they should be called a woman. So ultimately, you're not pointing out some witty linguistic loophole, you're trying to assert an absolute truth. Besides, to you, it's definitely not just about the words someone uses or a matter of common courtesy. You want them to really believe that you're just as much of a woman as, well, a real woman. I say this because I've seen them have hissy fits over their sneaking and astute suspicion that even though other people use their pronouns, they're still not seen as a legitimate girl. Well, as long as your worldview remains entirely incoherent, that will continue to happen. I've watched a lot of video essays on this topic from the most competent and feared breadtubers in the land, the intellectual heavyweights of cross-dressing, if you will, and they all ultimately revert to saying that there is no consensus.
No one can tell you what a woman is. In fact, it's barely a useful line of inquiry.
Well, maybe we don't need a theory. Maybe we don't need to prove anything. Bad things, Justine. Bad things. Well, do we have a theory about why people are gay? No, they just are. The only reason we even feel like we need a theory about trans people is that society is so unaccepting of us that it's constantly demanding we justify our own reality. Okay, so what am I supposed to tell Jackie Jackson then? What am I supposed to tell the TERFs? That I'm a woman because reasons? No, not even because reasons. Just because you are. So it's what, a leap of faith? Oh, great. I'm sure that's going to convince all the rational skeptics.
So, for the sake of argument, we could actually grant that yes, the act of identifying as a particular gender is not what causally makes that statement true. It might turn out that strict gender performativism is false, but all that's needed for the project of advancing trans rights is for us to realize that self-identification statements about gender made by trans people can be true. What exactly it is that makes them true, ask 3 scholars and you'll get 4 opinions. But the fact that they can be true means that the onus is on the rest of us, cis people, to take statements like that morally, legally, politically, practically, personally, very, very seriously.
You have no answer, but you say it's fine because people should be able to do whatever makes them happy. Sure, except even though you inevitably fall back on that, it's not the core point you're making. You don't want people to leave you alone, you want to force them to call you by certain pronouns. You don't want equal rights, you want me to pay for whatever bimbification procedures you see fit under a system of universal healthcare. You're trying to make judgments on what ought to be and state moral imperatives about what people owe you. You just refuse to provide concrete explanations as to why. When I ask what a female gender identity is even supposed to refer to, seeing as it can't be anything biological, social, or aesthetic without being transphobic to someone, it's not a clever retort to say that no one can define it. You're the one claiming we have to give trans kids puberty blockers or else it's child abuse. You better have an answer to that question. As a side note, they like to claim the effects are reversible, but the data doesn't actually exist yet. When we're talking about experimenting on children and compelling speech, there is no staying in the fairy tale realm of let's all be nice and live and let live. But there is no other way out for them. The only answer that fits their ideology is that a woman is anyone who identifies as one, even though that defeats the purpose of identifying as a woman in the first place. For people who used to belong to the atheist skeptic community, as many such as ContraPoints did, their core tenet now ultimately reeks of faith in something metaphysical. We've gone from the feminist idea that a person doesn't have to perform the stereotype of their biological sex to be valid, to the early trans concept that a person's biological sex is irrelevant and all that matters is what they perform, to now, where both those concepts are constructed and gender identity is the absolute, that not only you, but everyone around you has to conform to. That's right. The element at the bottom of your sexuality is completely undefinable. Postmodernism and its consequences have truly been a disaster for Western civilization. I say you have to conform because it is technically unacceptable to try to rid yourself of trans inclinations, or simply try treatments other than transitioning. They say the science proves that transitioning is the most effective option, but they quite literally haven't tried anything else using modern methodology in a properly conducted scientific study, because that'd be transphobic. You're also not allowed to do a controlled trial on transition, because depriving the control group of HRT for the duration of the study would be unethical, since it's so effective at saving their lives. How do we know it's so good? Because our premise is that being trans is a valid identity, unlike those other researchers who think it's a pathology. Aren't they totally biased? The data that does exist, such as a 30-year Swedish study, shows that they're still extremely suicidal after treatment compared with the general population. Another review of more than 100 studies of post-op transsexuals by the University of Birmingham found no solid evidence that gender reassignment surgery is effective. If you think that's because these people don't get enough social acceptance, then we can move the goalpost forever on that. Of course, none of that matters. If you try alternative treatments, you're just attempting to deny your true identity due to internalized transphobia. But then again, who are you to tell anyone what their true identity is?